Hello and welcome to this YouTube video channel. My name is Chris Philpott and this is my channel on the climate emergency and spiritual values. All figures and facts presented in this video can be verified in my book on the climate emergency and green spirituality, activism, a last chance to change our values. Now, we talked a bit before about Buddhism, and I'm going to bring spiritual values into every video because that's the basis of our behavior that causes climate change. And one of the things that we're talking about today is something you'll see in the news. You'll see it in the media, like we saw hurricanes in program 7, you'll see heat waves and wildfires in program 8. In program 8, we're looking at extreme weather from that point of view, extreme heat. There's no doubt that the heat we are generated comes from excess greenhouse gases. We've created it ourselves, because we haven't lived in balance. Living in moderation is part of the Buddhist teaching, you remember, the middle path, not too extreme, moderate consumption. The Dalai Lama puts it this way: we need to live in harmony and balance. He says, because we share all the planet Earth, we have to live in harmony and peace with each other and with nature. This is not a dream, but a necessity. We've had a look at balance in previous programs, the Baha'i teachings. Abdul Baha talked about balance. He said, for every part of the universe is connected with every other part by ties that are very powerful and admit to no imbalance. You can see from these pictures what happens in heat waves. People cover themselves with water, they jump into fountains, anything to get cool. They drink a lot of water. The hot summers are becoming more frequent, and you probably realise that where you're living. Now, between the period, research has shown between 1951 and 1980, the hot summers appeared, or hot extreme heat, like heat waves, appeared 0.1, 0.2% of the land area. Today, it's 10% of the area of the Earth gets this extreme weather. And research has shown that a third of the population could experience extreme heat. Now, the problem is, as regards human health, is that we have become urbanized. There are more people in urban areas than in rural areas now. And cities are getting huge, huge. Tokyo, Shanghai, look around you in the developing world, they're getting bigger. Now what happens is there's a heat island effect. The radiation from the sun is absorbed by the buildings. They hold that heat. And then he can't escape very easily from the city, so it gets hotter and hotter. This video explains quite clearly how this happens.
This excessive heat within cities has a name, the urban heat island, and it can actually significantly change the weather happening around it.
Now, heat can be transferred in 3 different ways, but the 2 that matter the most in cities are convection and radiation.
Radiation is obvious, and it's the reason you wear sunscreen. When sunlight hits the ground, much of the shortwave radiation is absorbed and some of it is reflected. But this absorbed radiation actually gets released as longwave radiation at night back into the atmosphere, which is why the ground naturally cools down. But because of the street canyon configuration and irregular geometry of city infrastructure, it's more difficult for this radiation to be released back into the atmosphere. Instead, it slowly warms the air directly around it, causing warmer air temperatures at night. Convection, which is the transfer of heat through the movement of fluids, is inhibited by increased surface roughness. Wind can't transfer heat away from the city efficiently because it gets pushed out of the way by tall infrastructure. So essentially you end up with a dome of immovable hot air in the center of downtown.
But not a problem, because you can just close your windows and turn on your air conditioner, right?
Well, if you do that, your air conditioner will be generating heat outside of your room, which will contribute to the heat island. And if everyone does this at the same time, then it causes a spike in consumed power, generating even more net heat and leading to a possible outage. It's happened many, many times. Several studies have linked urban heat islands to be positively correlated with larger populations, which makes sense. The more people in a city, the larger the infrastructure, the more heat absorbed, the more power consumed. Columbus, Ohio has about 1 million people living in the metro area, and out of 60 US cities, it ranked the 8th most intense urban heat island in the summer. On average, it's 4.4 degrees hotter in the city than outside of the 270 loop.
Now, heat is a danger to health if the temperature rises to about 38 core body temperature, 38 degrees centigrade. We've all seen this ourselves. You get exhaustion, you can't think straight. You're very uncomfortable physically. But if the temperature keeps rising to 42 degrees centigrade for a few hours, then death may result, or you'll have heat stroke. And this is very serious medical emergency. If you don't get help quickly, the body temperature cannot get down to stability. There is something you might not have heard of called the wet bulb temperature. And this is the lowest temperature the body can achieve through sweating. And it happens when there's temperature and humidity. The two together come together. This is very dangerous. When 35 degrees centigrade wet bulb temperature is reached, you can't sweat anymore. If you can't sweat, you can't lose heat. And it's a medical emergency. The Marines and the military are well aware there are areas in the world where this does happen already. And the Marines call it black flag weather. This video further explains this idea.
The upper temperature limit of the human body is expressed in terms of something called the wet bulb temperature. The wet bulb temperature is the lowest temperature air can be cooled to by evaporating water into it until it can't hold any more water vapor. The wet bulb temperature therefore provides a measure of how well the body can cool itself by sweating. Sweating helps us maintain a skin temperature equal to the wet bulb temperature, ideally below our core body temperature of about 37 degrees Celsius. Exposure to wet bulb temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius for more than 6 hours is therefore enough to cause even the fittest human body to overheat and begin to fail. Around the globe, wet bulb temperatures rarely exceed 31 degrees Celsius. But over the Persian Gulf and Red Sea, persistently clear skies, strong absorption of sunlight, and high evaporation rates combine to maximize the flow of heat over these regions, producing wet bulb temperatures that have historically exceeded 31 degrees Celsius.
Now, some researchers said that this type of wet bulb temperature will displace more people than sea level rise. Now, this is pretty serious if people can't work outside on the land to produce food. There's evidence that this type of temperature situation may start to occur in the future, in this century, in the North China Plain. Well, why is that significant? Well, 400 million Chinese live there, and it's the rice bowl of China. So if they can't work outside and produce food, they can't have robots do it. What's going to happen to China? Where are those people going to go? How are they going to feed their people? There's also research that this type of temperature may occur in areas of the Ganges and Indus plains. Why is that significant? Because millions live there in Pakistan and India. It's again an agricultural area, so if people can't go outside, they can't work on the land. And richer nations don't have robots or automated tractors or other things like that. Where are those people going to go if they can't, if it becomes uninhabitable? Lastly, it's something that I find personally interesting, is my brother, when he was alive, lived in Dubai, and I went to visit him for his birthday. And in Dubai, you see the most amazing prosperity in the Gulf states, the Arab Emirates. It's just wealth beyond all measure. The highest buildings on the planet were built there. In Dubai, they have a ski club. Even though the temperature is so high, they use electricity to create a snow environment. You go in the mall and you see people skiing. That's all going to end. There's evidence to say the Gulf states will have such high temperatures, nobody can function outside. So even if Abu Dhabi gets a green city or whatever, they'll still find it hard to live there. And we're not talking about water shortages, we're just talking about being outside. So let's have a look at some of the historical evidence we have of what happens in heat waves. In Europe, in 2003, there was the hottest summer since 1540, and it occurred that more than 70,000 people died. Elderly and children are very vulnerable to these extremes of temperature. It's hard for them to control the temperature. In 2010, we had incredible heat wave in Russia. There were 56,000 deaths, not only from just the heat, where people couldn't cool down, but actually a lot of the fires in the forest caused so much pollution. Even in the cities, people had a lot of respiratory problems. So, not only that, but what happens when there's fires like that? 9 million hectares of land in Russia was devastated by the dryness of the earth. And it meant they couldn't export wheat, which had an effect on the provision of food in the whole world. So there's knock-on effects of this. There's research to say that the 2010 type of heat wave could increase if we do business as usual and we don't control greenhouse gases, and the temperature keeps on going up and up and up. Those occurrences could be increased by a factor of 5 to 10 in the next 40 years. So those emergency situations for countries may well be more frequent in the future. So in Europe, we've had heat waves, but the World Meteorological Organization that monitors weather found in Europe in 2018, the June record temperature, that there was a much heat wave, and the June temperature in 2019 was the hottest ever recorded. Those heat waves, there's an estimate of 1,500 deaths in Europe. Now, we go to North America. A developed country should cope well with heat. Now, they've got a very interesting historical occurrence of heat waves. And this is where the heat island effect was perfectly shown. And this incident in 1995 in Chicago is a wake-up call for countries to be prepared for these heat extreme events. Because over a period of 5 days, 739 people were killed by the heat. And the heat waves in North America are increasing. In 2012, there was a severe heat wave in the USA and Canada, and 104 people died from heat death. In 2018 in Canada, there were 70 deaths from heat exhaustion. In 2019, there was another heat wave over North America. And guess what? You can tell how things are heating up. Because as you can see from this map, Anchorage in Alaska is only 370 miles from the Arctic Circle. They registered a top temperature there in 2019 of 32 degrees centigrade, which in fact was warmer than New York, which is a lot further south. So North America, as a developed area of the world, have a lot of problems even with their facilities dealing with heat waves. Now we come to the less developed part of the world. An example is India. Now, in India, I've been there, and I can tell you something, the electricity supply is not always on hand. And when you walk through the streets of Delhi sometimes, when there's a power cut, you'll smell awful diesel generators. The fumes are awful. That's if you have air conditioning, which a lot of people don't, because they can't afford it, because they're too poor. So when the infrastructure is not there in terms of air conditioning or medical facilities like hospitals, because it's a specialist thing, when people overheat, you need intervention quickly and timely, or people die. So there's a history of heat waves in India. In 2010, while Russia was having their heat wave, India was as well. And there were 1,300 deaths from heat stroke. In 2015, another heat wave. More deaths, 2,200 deaths. In 2015, there was the awful incident in Karachi, probably caused by the heat island effect, when there were 2,500 people died of excess heat. And so it continues. In 2019, they found that 65% of India was experiencing temperatures in May and June of over 40 degrees centigrade. Well, I went to India actually in June and July, and you know something? That was in 2002. And I had to carry, and you might see in the pictures in my introduction, I had to carry a towel around my neck all the time because I sweated so much, because it was about 40 there. So, and it was difficult to function sometimes. You had to drink a lot. So I've experienced that sort of heat in India. If we look at Australia, well, this is the hottest and driest continent on Earth. In Victoria, as you see from the map, and South Australia, in 2009, there was a heat wave, 432 people died. The Climate Council did a report in 2014, and it said that the hot days in Australia have doubled since 1950, the very extreme heat, hot days. The Australian government in 2016 brought out a report and said that by 2050, there may be 2,000 heat-related deaths a year in their population. We come through. We all remember 2019 in Australia with the fires, but there was extreme heat as well. And you can see their level of heat because they found that the fruit on the fruit trees was cooking itself inside. So what does it do to humans and wildlife? So one of the features, apart from affecting humans, heat affects the land because it causes wildfires. If you've got dry material in forests, like there's litter in forests, you can see it. And particularly if that forest is planted with species that ignite, it's not designed to deal with fire. It's interesting, in California, I watched a webinar where there was an expert on how to arrange forests with older species that the Native American Indians knew would plant so that fires didn't spread so much. So monoculture of forests is a factor as well of spreading the fires. But it's only just spark from lightning, natural occurrence. Spark, litter, fire started, right? And on top of that, some humans start fires. They always say don't start fires, but some people have a barbecue or something and it gets out of control. So this is a very serious issue, wildfires. Not only does it affect the biodiversity and kill it off, it also affects actual production. If it's agricultural land, it's written off for years because it's burnt. But there's a lot of loss of property. Often in Australia and America, buildings are made of wood, so ideal for fires. So there was an incident in 2009 in Australia called Black Saturday, where there were 180 people died from a wildfire. But look at these figures, 1.1 million acres was burnt. So that land will be out of production in the future for a long time. Then we have more destruction of land. In 2013, approximately 200,000 acres were burnt. And 2014, another roughly 200,000 acres were burnt. So that's a lot of land lost. In the 2015-16 season, there were 780,000 acres of land burnt. Then we come to the present day. You've seen the videos in 2019, 2020, the horrible fires in New South Wales and other places in Australia. A very, very sad occurrence, because 24 people died in those fires, but there were 15.6 million acres destroyed by fire. And of course, the trauma for people is 1,400 homes were just burnt. So you've got the psychological effect of people watching their houses burn. In one incident, They only escaped death because they went down the beach and they were practically in the sea, so the fire couldn't reach them. Now we come to America, in the USA. We've seen evidence of this before in southwest Arizona, New Mexico, and western Texas. There's a great wildfire risk. Why? Because the temperature is really high. It's hot, heating up in that area in the southwest of the states really fast. So in 2011, there were 3 million acres burned in this area. In 2012, there were lots of fires in the western part. 9.2 million acres burned, lost land. In 2015, Alaska and the western states were burning. 10 million acres ruined. Now you often think of Alaska as being very cold and very north, but if it's dry in the right conditions, a fire will start. Now, the Sunshine State, the great prosperity like Dubai and so forth, California, is under terrible risk of wildfires. There was a really bad wildfire season in 2017 and 47 people died. And 220,000 acres were burnt. And 8,400 buildings were destroyed. That's homes for people. In 2018, there were 85 people killed. And so it goes on. California is drying out. Fire risk is becoming greater. And it's no use Trump coming in as he did and said, oh, it's the way they manage the forests, the Forestry Service, blame them. It's not climate change. Well, actually it is, Donald. It's climate change because it's drying out and heating up the land. In Europe, we've had our problems. I remember watching on the TV in 2017, Portugal was ablaze. There were 64 people died and 100,000 acres of land was burnt. So, in 2018, Greece is turned to have wildfires, and I saw that on the telly as well. 102 people died. Again, people escaped because they went to the beach. But what is sad, it's not only agricultural land that's lost, it's the biodiversity lost. In Australia, there were 1 billion animals lost in that fire. So, this is the consequence of climate change. And I make no excuse for the figures, because the figures illustrate the seriousness of the effects of the destruction of real people with real lives. Unless we start to decrease our greenhouse gases, the earth is going to heat up and heat up and heat up. It's rather like the cover of my book, showing the flames. The wildfires will continue. The heat waves will continue and get worse and worse unless we stop releasing carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. We can't heat the earth anymore. The earth responds when it's overheating, just like we do. We sweat. The earth causes heat waves and wildfires. Thank you.